So we're here for the Future Planning Subcommittee meeting this evening. LakeCAM is here videotaping, so folks are aware of that. First order of business is nomination of a chairperson. A motion on the floor.
Nancy wants it. No? Sure.
Motion to nominate Nancy Souza from Madam
I second that.
Sorry, chairperson from Evelyn, and the second from Mrs. Cruz. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. This evening we're here to talk about future planning as it pertains to Old Colony Regional Vocational Technical High School. Maybe we can begin by just introducing ourselves around the table. I know for folks here we may know each other, but if folks are watching, as a courtesy to those who may be watching, it might be nice to introduce ourselves. Bob Souza, Facilities Director.
Mike Parker, Principal, Old Colony.
Don Foster, representing Lakeville.
Sarah Griffith, the Business Manager.
Jolene Costa, District Secretary and Administrative Assistant Superintendent.
Aaron Polinsky, Superintendent Director.
Nancy Souza, Town of Manapoiset.
Joanne Pushkar, the Town of Carver. Evelyn Boulay, the Town of Acushnet.
Sharon Cruz, the Town of Rochester.
Thank you. So what we're looking to talk about is the status of our current facility and the future planning as it pertains to Old Colony. Just so folks are aware, current applications for the class of 2024 are double what we're able to accept. That trend has been ongoing for a couple of years right now, and we're trending currently with a number of applicants that was reflective of the number of applicants we had in July of last year. So we're ahead of last year's numbers. That being said, we're looking at the needs of the district as it pertains to the facility and accommodating as many students as possible and the possible expansion of programming. In order to do that, we require updates to our facility either in the form of a new facility or renovation to the existing facility, because our current facility does not allow us to serve the demand for the school. That being said, we've had some conversations with some schools who are currently involved in projects. Those include Tri-County, Cape Cod Tech, Minuteman, Diamond, Bristol Aggie, Blue Hills, and Whittier, to get a feel for where they've come from and what they've done. We did send out an overview of the MSBA process, both in PowerPoint form and a copy of the October webinar that was run by Jack McCarthy and the MSBA to give people a closer view of how that process works. After watching the webinar and looking at the PowerPoint, there was some thought that when you put in a statement of interest for this type of project, it is not always the case that that statement of interest is accepted in its first year. It can take years of submissions before a statement of interest is accepted. The statement of interest closing date for this year is April 8th of 2020. And in the webinar that we watched, there was indication that if you submit by April of 2020, their goal is to get back to you by December of 2020. So there is a gap, there's a waiting period to even find out if you've qualified. There's no cost to apply and submit an SOI. However, we have to be aware that there's timing relative to that.
Time sensitive.
Yep, time sensitive, and for every year that we wait, we look at costs increasing. So we thought, Mr. Souza and I talked at one point when he first came on board, and he is familiar with the process. Much of the process for the core program, which is what we would be looking at, involves an ed plan and then really an overview of the history of our capital expenses and upkeep, which our business manager is able to help us with and has great record keeping of. Our vision for the school, as it pertains to programming, which Mr. Parker and I can address, and then the history and current status of our facility, which Mr. Souza will play a huge part in. We have several sample statements of interest from other schools that we also shared with the subcommittee and the group of folks at this table. And after reviewing those statements of interest, I think it's feasible that we could submit something by April of this year successfully, with the knowledge that there's no cost involved. And I have faith in myself, Mr. Parker, Mrs. Griffith, and Mr. Souza, and our ability to do that. After watching the webinar and reviewing the PowerPoint, a lot more confidence as it pertains to that. We just received a letter from NEASC, which is included in this packet, and that NEASC recommendation is around updates to our facility, which plays a big part in support for the submission. The other piece that we have not explored yet as a school is the idea of a facility audit. And while it's recommended, it's certainly optional for a statement of interest. If we were to submit a statement of interest for this coming April, I wouldn't foresee a facility audit necessarily being a part of that. There's some costs involved. There's some planning involved. Mr. Souza may be able to speak a little bit more to that.
There's also a time piece, right, where you have to select someone, you have to bring on board, the audit takes a longer amount of time itself, and then there's the report that has to be written.
Right.
So I wouldn't see that as being part of the solution process, not for this year anyway.
It could be considered in the future, but the time required for that may not allow us to do that in our initial attempts. And so I just list that because in reviewing the many examples we had, there were some schools that were successfully invited into the pipeline with a facility audit, and others that were invited in without a facility audit. So it's just food for thought. There are votes required for member towns after an invitation from the MSBA to come in, and those votes are required prior to a feasibility study and also prior to the actual approval of project funding. That timeline is shown in this core program process overview that's included in the packet, and it shows where the votes are required for funding. Per our district agreement, there are 3 approved ways of approaching the votes per Mass General Law, Chapter 71, 2 which are feasible, 1 which does not seem to make sense for us as a district. Section 16D, paragraph 1, and Section 16N are included in the packet that was made for folks this evening, and there are copies of the way those votes take place. 16D is by town. 16N is by the masses, so to speak. The recommendation I received from colleagues is that you would pursue in your initial correspondence a vote through 16D, which goes by town. It would require a unanimous vote from each of our member towns in support of a project.
So, Aaron, if I understand properly, an early step that we have to complete using the 16D approach is each of the 5 current towns would have to receive a favorable vote at town meeting about engaging in this project.
That would be prior to feasibility, but not necessarily prior to SOI because there are no costs involved. However, to your point, the recommendation I have from colleagues is that in March, because we're already in February, but at some time in March, it may make sense to set up an opportunity for member towns to tour the facility and really see what we're looking at and give them an idea of the current status as it pertains to space, facilities use, maintenance and upkeep, which our staff does a wonderful job of despite the fact that the facility was built in 1975, and the need for improvements to infrastructure.
So looking at 16D, the first 3 words caught my eye. When any one of us stand up to explain this at town meeting, taxpayers and residents are going to want to know approximately what kind of debt are we going to incur. So somewhere along here, we have to have some kind of a budgetary estimate, approximate estimate of what we're looking at.
And I believe that that takes place through the feasibility study. When we conduct a feasibility study in preparation, we'll be able to look at numbers and potential debt that would be incurred as a result of the project. The other piece that was recommended by folks who have been through the process is to share with our legislative group what it is that's happening at Old Colony, what the trends are, and to provide them with an opportunity to see the facility and to invite them in for a tour and perhaps a legislative breakfast where they can see the nature of our current state and also take part in a visioning process and understand where it is we're looking to bring Old Colony for expansion purposes. And then to conduct some open meetings for, as Mr. Foster indicated, there are going to be community members who have interest. And so it's very important that we reach out to all stakeholders and bring them in to be a part of the process and provide opportunities for them to see Old Colony.
I think one of the things that we should do early on is we begin to communicate with the public about our plans and the fact that there are sides to or components to our global plan, which is curriculum enhancement, enhancing our regional position with more communities, as well as adding new labs, new classrooms, new workshops, new storage space, new faculty space, and so forth. I think people are going to want to know, well, what curriculum are you going to add? How's our town going to benefit from this?
Right.
What new things don't we have that you think we should have?
Sure.
Plumbing,
Right.
plumbing.
Plumbing?
Right. Plumbing, HVAC are a couple of programs that have been identified as potential areas for.
I think it would be really great to ask the 5 communities,
Yeah.
what do you want?
Sure.
Get them on board early,
Yeah.
so they know.
We could contact our moderators and we could really get that out there, because we have that biannually. So it'd be easy to make that a shout out. Just an idea.
Sure, and also the labor market analyses are required by the Department of Ed. Anytime we add a program, they want to know that there's a labor market demand for it. And so we have to look at the labor market and make sure that as we're preparing students for life beyond the graduation stage, that there are placement opportunities for them. Because if there aren't,
Co-op and all that.
right, the department will not approve new programming if it is not in line with the labor market analysis.
Just that.
A lot of the South Coast workforce development they have reports on these. So we have some South Coast reports that we can reference as part of that initiative.
I just have a question. When I listened to the webinar, one of the things that was recommended was, I don't know if they mentioned a specific school or a couple of schools that within their group had a public relations little smaller subcommittee to take care of, take care of those getting the information out, probably getting the feedback from the stakeholders and that. I know this is a smaller group, so we may be able to do that in conjunction with the entire committee. I don't know, that would be something I can discuss. And the second thing I went on their website, and this caught my eye, and it made me a little concerned. It said an SOI should only be filed for a facility where a district has the ability to fund a construction project in the next 2 years. That, when you're saying ability to fund the construction project, I know we don't want to waste time, but I think we need to keep that in mind when we're doing this. I didn't know if it was a way to approach it was to this year is to get all the information and put it out to the MSBA and say, because they said this is a partnership, we want to help you in that webinar, and we work with you through the whole process. So I want to be sure that we touch all the areas that are important, and I just didn't know if that 2-year timeline was going to give us enough time.
Right, and I think Don shared a similar sentiment when he said we need to know what the costs are that we'd be incurring before we take on a project of this scope. Because the reimbursement rates fluctuate from 31% all the way up to 80%, depending upon what your population is and what criteria you meet. And then there are bonus points that you get for expanded regionalization and other items of the sort, gold building, green building, a reputation of well-maintained facilities, all work in your favor. So that there's a lot to consider. I think as we said as a full committee a month ago and talked about convening to have the conversation, the goal for tonight was to simply put out some details that would better educate us as a group, and then we could make a decision about whether it's something that, to your point, Nancy, do we want to pursue for April of this year, or do we want to wait a year, as you've indicated, to make sure that we may or may not have the funding available. But I think per the desire of the full committee to convene and have a conversation, I've tried to gather this information to the best of my ability and talk with some colleagues so that we can be better informed as we make a decision about how to proceed.
Because I was hoping to, when I went on the site, the website, I was hoping to get the application so I could say, okay, here's what they're looking for, and this kind of sets you up on what you need to do. But you have to sign in as the superintendent and get that. I don't know it. Do they have a draft copy that they will give you so that we know what they want? And then that may be able to say, okay, we can develop a timeline and say, we can get this done, we want to get it done by this time, and kind of mirror it so that when we're ready within the 2 years, just go, okay, I think now we can go.
Yeah,
It's not on their site, I know that. You have to, because
I
it's
have to
all
go on.
electronic, and the superintendent has to sign in.
Right,
I think
which is-
having a model's a good idea.
yeah, and which is why we asked some other schools who have recently been accepted into the pipeline for copies of what they submitted.
Yeah.
And there's a trend, if you look at what has been submitted around what's been asked for that initial SOI, much of which is focused on the facility, capital improvements of recent, the education plan. And so those things I don't think are overwhelming in terms of putting them together, so to speak. They may be a little bit time consuming, but they're more technical than anything. I think the bigger piece is around obviously funding and having a greater understanding of what it is. And until we go through a feasibility process, it's very difficult to put a number to that. But there's a cost associated with feasibility as well.
But the towns that have already submitted, do they already have approval from their town saying that they were interested in going ahead with?
So when I talked to Cape Cod Tech, and I talked to Bob Sanborn, who's their superintendent, he said they had submitted SOIs for a few years before they were ever invited into the pipeline, and that they weren't accepted right away. The same holds true for Steve Dockeray at Tri-County. He said, it wasn't our initial SOI that was accepted. It took a couple of rounds before we were ever even accepted into the pipeline for feasibility. And so, as I looked at the form, the 29-page form that one submitted and the 24-page form that the other school submitted, and looked at what was submitted specifically, it looked like a lot of work done by facilities, a lot of work done around visioning for the educational plan, which we've talked a lot about already as an administrative team, and as a school committee in terms of our thoughts for expansion. I think that there have been little dabbles in that.
But were the towns already a go for it before the schools did?
I think the towns were brought in Bob said to me, he submitted an SOI and had meetings with the town to let them know of their intention to submit, but that it doesn't mean that you're committing necessarily. I know it says be ready within 2 years, but Bob said to me that it was not necessarily that they were asking for a solid commitment, but rather telling people that they're exploring the potential, if that makes sense.
And if you don't get accepted, this is the first time, that 2 years starts to be 3, 4, so
Correct.
if you wait.
Minuteman, I believe, was 11 years, or 14 years.
We've had 2 additions put on where I work, and I remember, and it took us a while. It wasn't once, it was again.
Sure.
And we just got it.
So
But it happened.
I hope, if there are questions, I'll do my best to answer. If I don't know any answers, I'll certainly write down what folks had questions about and bring that to the full committee if you'd like. I don't think that this was necessarily intended to be a lengthy meeting, but rather an informational meeting, and I hope that what I provided at least provides a little bit more of a background as to the process. You know, in terms of researching, again, curriculum, instruction, Mike and I typically work very collaboratively around that. Finances is always Sarah, and then facilities is always Bob. And so those are the major players that I wanted to make sure we had at the table if possible, because each of us plays a little part in this. And historically, Sarah's always been able to pull up the reports as they pertain to capital projects history, our train contracts, et cetera.
Good job.
Where in the process is that idea of adding new programs? Because I know it's quite a process to get new Chapter 74 programs. Where does that, if we want to add HVAC plumbing, where does that fit in?
Our educational program. So when we write our educational program, we would write about our intention and expectation to provide more than we're currently providing. Currently, we accept 150 students, but we have over 300 applications for 150 slots. 3 years ago, it was 188 applications for 150 slots. So that exponential growth results in a higher demand. We can't accommodate the demand right now to the extent we would like to. And we want to be able to accept as many students as we possibly can while maintaining an expectation and an education for the students that's productive for them. But in order to do that, we have to be able to expand. And right now, we've modified lunches. We have students participating in classes, health classes. We've brought tables and chairs actually into the gym to accommodate and open up other spaces in the building. There are some classes that take place in the cafeteria when it's available, because we're trying to maximize use of the space. And we're not complaining. I think that everybody's doing a wonderful job with that, but we'd like to be able to do more. And to add plumbing or to add HVAC, there's really nowhere to put it. We just visited Madison Park on January 27th, and to see the expansive nature of the building that they had, one of the comments that the students even made was, wow, this place is huge. And their executive director said to us, when we need to add a program, we have places where we can do it. When we need to add a program, we're really limited, to the point where we talked about temporary classrooms and spaces that we can bring in. And I talked to Sarah a couple of years ago, we looked at the costs, and they were pretty expensive to even bring in your portable classrooms. So it's food for thought. It's not a quick decision. It's a marathon and not a sprint. But this was intended to be just an initial conversation to perhaps get the dialogue moving and to provide as much information.
We'll make it a half marathon.
I think we need I keep going back to this, I'm sorry for beating on it, but I think we need to have a kind of a global snapshot of what our overall project is that has the three major parts. One is the facilities enhancement, the second is curriculum enhancement, and the third is adding another town to our region, and how it all fits together. We have to be sure that those three pieces do fit, which means that
facilities, curriculum, expansion of the regional agreement, correct?
Yeah, and I think that we have to somehow figure out that if we add, let's say, plumbing and HVAC, and I think there was a third one that we had talked about at one time, potentially. But would that bring in additional students, or does this mean that we lower the standards so we can accept more students? I mean, where are those?
I think it would mean additional students, and I think that while the demand has increased, and I don't know that it means lowering the standard, so to speak. I think
I want it to.
Right. I think that it means the opportunity to educate more students and provide them with opportunities.
Is there some way we can get a sense of how realistic that is from the 5 or 6 towns that we now serve? And we find out how many additional students might be interested in coming to Old Colony because it has HVAC or it has.
I was thinking along the same lines. That goes out to the same premise of the communication to the community, see what programs they really would want to see, instead of us saying plumbing and HVAC, and if you start the dialogue now, and you keep the conversation going throughout, whether we apply this year or next year, whatever, it's on the radar of all our towns because we started asking those questions in advance.
And the job market, right?
Right.
That's
The labor market
the
analysis
labor
is really a
market.
huge
Well,
driver.
that would certainly tell us or give a strong indication of which new programs we'd like to have. but what does that result in terms of headcount?
Right.
Okay, how about, can we do a survey monkey of
Right.
internally of the students that you have here? Say, if there was an additional shops, which ones would you like? Maybe you could put a few out there, or maybe they could write one in.
Why does it have to be just the kids inside? Why can't we then publish that to the communities?
Then you could do it
And
to
have them bring
to
it
the
in
middle
and-
schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you.
another
Yeah, I
approach
just
is
wanted
to
think of
ask-
something simple.
Another approach might be to ask some other voc techs that have these programs, what the headcounts are in their various programs,
They all have that information, you can get that in
and,
RB.
and make a general assumption that in our population of 5 or 6 towns, we have about the same proportional number of kids who would be interested in the new program as exist in Diamond or New Bedford or EP or whatever it might be.
Sure, and in fairness to
I mean,
to the process, I think that a lot of variables, well, as many of us are educators, a lot of variables come into play when it comes to popularity of program. Because you could have a Pied Piper who really generates interest and students feel nurtured and loved and cared about and want to be a part of that program. And then there are other facets where a program might be in high demand and students associate that with great opportunities outside of school, labor market, etc. So I think there are a lot of considerations that come into play as we gauge those things. And I think it's valid to, as people have said, to survey students, to survey our districts that are sending our students to get a feel for where their interests may fall. For sure.
So I guess the question would be, do you feel comfortable that you could gather all the information that the application needs by April?
I do, and I have added confidence after seeing the webinar. So there was a piece of me that was hesitant because initially I thought, gosh, if we submit this, as you said, are we committing to something? And my understanding is that we're not. My understanding is that we're submitting this, and while they said be ready in 2 years if you're invited, it doesn't mean we have to say yes either.
And it may take several years
It
to
could,
get.
but however, to your point, it could take several years. And in my mind, I thought it made sense to be proactive and to perhaps take the initiative to put something out. And again, when Bob and I met earlier, when he first came on board, he has familiarity with this because he's done it before.
There's another piece that the MSBA, when they look at a statement of interest, okay, they have this enormous list, right? So we did ask them once a couple of times, and I think I did it this last April, and they may be doing it again this April. I think they got a visit this summer. So they have this enormous list, and then you get put on a short list, and if the board comes down and they actually tour your facility and see how you fit.
Mm-hmm.
So that sometimes, and we had a couple of schools that asked once that, but we never made the short list. So to your point, to yours, it's a waiting game. You know, there's a lot of needy.
And I'd hate to delay another year.
Yes.
If
Yes,
you could,
so I say April.
if you felt comfortable, I mean, it's all, because a lot of this is gonna be the gathering of information from internally.
But he seems to have it innate.
I mean, there's people that can, and you've got good resources on.
I feel confident because I also feel confident in the colleagues who have supported us in the research to this point. And when you look at the documents side by each, there's truly a pattern of what seems to be prevalent here as well. So I looked at their applications and I thought, geez, these people were invited into the pipeline. These are a lot of the issues we're faced with. So it seemed to make sense to at least put something in, and that allows us to have been proactive and at least know where we stand. And at the same time, to share with our member towns where we're coming from and to provide them with further education about what it is we'd like to provide. So that was the thought process behind it.
So do we need to make a motion to, or any?
I just think that when we have our full committee meeting,
Okay.
it would be great for Nancy to be able to share as the chair this discussion, and perhaps we'll share a copy of this particular piece in the small packet that we have, and then engage in a larger conversation with the group. And in the meantime, we have Dawn, myself, and a few other folks had worked on a visioning statement for our charter review dinner that we had. And I think that document, it gives a good vision relative to facilities, curriculum to some extent. I think we could probably add to that. And ideas around expansion of the region, because they're intertwined, as Mr. Foster said. They're not standalone issues. And they really are intertwined, and to provide additional programming results in ability to serve many more students and also folks from other regions, while there's a reciprocity that exists too. When a region joins, there's a benefit to the district as well. So I think that it comes full circle, and they don't stand independent of one another, but there's an order that's required. And this is a piece of that process.
Just having this meeting is a dream come true, okay? I'm happy.
So are you looking to take this before the full committee to get their approval, the approval to move forward for this application? Is that what the plan is?
I think we had talked about, when I set my goals initially, I had mentioned an SOI for this year, and then we had talked about, let's see where admissions goes, let's see how our applications look, are they continuing to trend high? They're higher than they've ever been. We're literally where we were in July of last year right now in February, which is a positive thing in one sense, and then a struggle because we can't take all of those students. And I'd like to be able to take it and help and provide as many students as possible in vocational education. In order to do that, we need to expand. And in what capacity, right? And so it's not so much, I think I want to return to the idea that it is possible to accomplish this year. The more we're learning, the more we're seeing that it's very possible to accomplish this year. While before I thought, can we do it? Now I'm looking at it and saying, yeah, I think we can. And
are you looking for the school committee, the entire school committee, to give you the approval to move forward? Is that really?
Not so much approval, but more to inform because I feel like the committee has been very much in support of the idea.
Right, I think it's.
And at the last meeting, the committee suggested that we assemble this group. And as a result of the committee's request, we did assemble this group. I think that now we can go back to the committee and say, you know what, it's with confidence that we think we can put something together for an SOI. We think it's in our best interest. I think it's a very positive step in a right direction. To put it off for a year results in the escalation of construction costs and inflation and whatever else we may be faced with. So to get out of the gates and know where we stand and get closer to that short list seems to make a whole lot of sense.
Yes, it does.
And so,
I'm in support of that.
Yeah, I'm saying it, we'll go crazy. That's it, damn. Okay,
do folks have any additional questions?
As the new chairperson, thank you. We're adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank
time.
you. This was great.